So cross-section of a spinal cord. This is part of actually what you need to know for your practical 2. And they're kind of easy ways of learning these parts and pieces of your spinal cord if you know what to look for. So over here are all of the parts that I'm about to talk about. But all I did in the next slide is I took this picture and I blew it up so that I can show you those parts and pieces. So here's my spinal cord. You'll notice that in the center I have a gray butterfly, right? This is the only part of your body that I know of where we have a butterfly. So notice that it's gray, so that's one thing. Everything associated with the butterfly is going to be gray. All of this out here, you'll notice isn't. This is white matter. Now in chapter 11, we talked about the difference between gray and white matter. Gray matter has unmyelinated axons. White matter has myelinated axons. White matter is always going to be like a superhighway. It carries things from point A to point B. Gray matter is where kind of integration happens and reaction happens and things like that. So I want you to notice that. Next thing I want you to know is the difference between the front and the back of the spinal cord. Notice that on this side of the spinal cord, where my butterfly is, the white matter is continuous. It goes all the way around. There's no cutoff. The butterfly doesn't cut any portion of this off. Literally, the white matter goes all the way around this. Yes, everybody sees that? That means this is the front, okay? Or if we want to be anatomical, we say this is the anterior. Okay? So this is anterior. If you look back here though, see how the wings of the butterfly are actually all the way to the edge, and this section of white matter is completely cut off? It's not continuous like what you see on this side. It actually stops, there's gray matter, and then it starts again. This is the back. Again, if you want to be real sciencey about it, you would say it is the posterior. So that gives you direction, okay? You've got the anterior up here, you've got the posterior back here. Now, let's look at the butterfly for a second. If I were to redraw this butterfly and it were to look more like this, does that look like a horn to you, like a cow horn? Well, for the sake of argument, let's say the shape is a horn, okay? So now you know the shape, you know the color, and you know the direction. This right here is one horn. What direction does it face? Well, it's posterior. What color is it? It's gray. What's its shape? It's a horn. This is the posterior gray horn. Okay? Now, if you look, there's kind of another little spike here. If it's not posterior, it's not anterior, but it's going to the sides. Our word for sides is lateral. So, this is the lateral. Color, gray. Shape, horn. Okay? This one is facing forward. So this is the anterior. Color, gray. Shape, horn. Now, if you have people coming together and talking, that it's said that they commiserate, okay? If you look here, do you see this chunk of gray matter that's between the two wings? This is called the Gray Commisure. Why? Because it's basically the two wings coming together. This hole that's right here. So remember, your spinal cord is actually this really long thing. It isn't just a slice like a lifesaver like this. So if I've got my butterfly up here and there's a hole here, this actually travels down the entire length of the spinal cord. So it's not really just a hole, it's a canal. And where is it located? It's located in the center, right? So this is called the central canal because it's right dead center, okay? Now, again, posterior, anterior, still the same. This is still posterior. This is still anterior. Let's talk about the white matter. So we know that we've got this long thing with the butterfly in the middle. If I were to just take this piece of the white matter right there in the back, this one right here, and isolate it, it would kind of look like that, right? So it kind of looks like a column in a building. Yes? That big thing that sits right outside the lab at the school. So again, if we know a color and we know the direction, then we should be able to give you the shape now because we know that it's the columns, right? So this is the posterior. What color is it? White. What's the shape? Column. What about the sides? What do we call that? Well, it's lateral. What color is it? White. What's its shape? Column. Look at this one. Where is it located? It's located in the front. So this is the anterior. White. Column. Okay? So again, if you know direction, if you know color, and you know shape, you kind of know quite a bit about my spinal cord, about the spinal cord. Now remember that we had this piece of gray matter that connected the two wings together. Well, do you see this piece of white matter that kind of connects this side to this side? You can also call this the white commissure, just like we had the gray commissure, because technically it is putting the two sides together. Now I want you to also notice that I have these kind of indentions in the back and then a really, really deep indention in the front. Well, what direction is this? This is anterior. Where is it located? Where is that crack located? Well, it's located dead center in the middle, so I can say median. And a really fancy way of saying crack is to call it a fissure. So this is the front middle crack. It's the anterior median fissure. Okay? In the back, I don't have as big of a crack. I more have kind of a fold. It's just kind of like a little fold there that you can see. Well, it's in the back, it's in the middle, so that's posterior median. But instead of calling it a fissure, because it really isn't, it's just kind of an indentation, we call it the sulcus. So that's the posterior median sulcus and the anterior median fissure. Okay? Now, let's talk about these bad boys out here. So, what do you call things that grow out of the base of a tree? You call them the roots, right? Well, these are the roots coming off of your spinal cord, only I've got some itty bitty teeny tiny ones, I've got bigger, and I've got this big bulgy thing right here. Okay? So, direction. This is posterior. These are teeny tiny roots, right? They're just so precious. So these are posterior rootlets. Because they're not really a root yet. They're still tiny, so they're rootlets, just like chiclets, the gum. But they do eventually come together and make something bigger. We call that the posterior root. I want you to notice this big bulgy thing. Remember I talked about this in like a couple slides ago. This is the posterior root ganglion. Remember the cell bodies, when you put them together, they make a big kind of poochy portion? That's what that is. Now, if you look at the front, look at the little roots. They're just so precious. Well, these are the anterior rootlets because they're on the front. Okay? Notice that there is no big bulgy thing, so this is just the anterior root. Now, when these two things combine, they merge together, we basically get what we call either the spinal nerve or the spinal root. They actually do merge and become one thing. In your labs, you actually have examples of this that you have to learn for your practical. And they are the spinal nerves coming out of the vertebra that you can see. They're little yellow pieces of rubber. So that is all the parts and pieces of your spinal cord. If you can remember direction, color, and shape, you're probably about, I'd say 80% of the way to knowing the spinal cord. Okay, so let's talk about the white matter. Remember what I said about the white matter. It's a highway. It just carries information. So I've got two types of information. I've got ascending information, meaning that it's going toward my brain, and I've got descending information. The pink areas are descending, meaning that my brain is going to tell my body to do something. So the blue are the ascending tracks that carry information from my body up to my brain. The pink are the descending tracks that carry information from my brain out into my body. When you look at the actual spinal cord itself and you look at information being carried, remember that spinal nerve that we just named right here? We actually call that a mixed nerve. And we call that a mixed nerve because it is carrying different types of information. So if you look at the example that we have here, you'll notice that I've got the sensory neuron, right? Sensory neurons carry information in. I stub my toe, that needs to go to my brain. That dorsal root only carries sensory information. So that dorsal root is incoming information. And the ganglia, remember I told you that's where the cell bodies are? Well, the cell body for a unipolar cell is actually there. That's why we call that a ganglion. And it isn't just one. They're normally multiple. I don't want you to think this is just one neuron, but this is the example. So the dorsal root always carries incoming information, incoming sensory information. I've got an interneuron here that connects my sensory to my motor, but I also have these arrows going up to the higher centers of my brain. If I stub my toe, I can't just take that to my spinal cord. My brain has to make a decision to pick up my foot. So I do need this information to go up to my brain to let it know that something happened. Now I want you to notice that my motor, my outgoing information, I actually have two different cells, okay? Interneuron, this guy that connects everything, he is actually going to be in the gray matter. This blue cell that you see here, this blue neuron, notice that its cell body is in the lateral gray horn, okay? This is my autonomic motor neuron. Remember, autonomic controls things that I am not aware of. It's automatic. I am not voluntarily controlling this, but it still is motor information. Let's say that my heart needs to speed up. This is the neuron that carries that information out to my heart. Let's say that I want my stomach to start moving. This is the neuron that carries that out. I do not control this because it is autonomic. Now, the other motor neuron that I have is the somatic. This is controlling my voluntary movements. I want you to notice something about the somatic. Its cell body is actually in the anterior gray horn, not the lateral gray horn. So this anterior gray horn has the cell body for my somatic voluntary motor neuron. And it also comes out through the ventral or anterior root. So sensory information gets carried through the dorsal root, up and in. Motor information gets carried out through the ventral root. Now, remember I told you that the spinal nerve is considered mixed. I said that right here. This is why. It doesn't just carry one type of information. It's not just sensory or motor. It's actually both. Sensory's coming in, motor's going out of that same nerve. So we say that it is a mixed nerve because of that. So let's talk reflexes. If we were to go with the most basic structure you have in your entire nervous system that functions, we would talk about the neuron, the one cell. It carries signal. But if we're talking about a basic functional unit, the most simple thing that we can talk about so that we can understand more complex functions, you would talk about the reflex arc. Okay? It's the smallest, simplest portion capable of receiving a stimulus and producing a response. It can be used as a tool to learn more about your nervous system and how it works. Pretty much, in order to understand the complicated things, you have to understand the simple first. So what is a reflex? A reflex is an automatic response to a stimulus and is produced by a reflex arc. It occurs without conscious thought. This is not something that we think about. I can bet you $5,000 that if I hit your knee with a mallet, I can get you to kick as long as you don't have nerve damage. Because it is a reflex. You don't think about it. It just automatically happens. Now, we do have somatic reflexes, like pain. We respond to pain usually before we feel pain. Autonomic reflexes, though, are more things like our blood pressure. Our body changes how we breathe. It changes how our heart's beating and things like that to look at blood pH and to deal with blood pH, to deal with blood pressure. Things that we have no idea. My blood sugar is high. Let me release insulin. I don't know that. My body knows it, but I don't. That's an autonomic reflex. That's something that just automatically happens. We've got two types of reflexes, monosynaptic and polysynaptic. So, sorry guys, I need to shift around a little bit. I've been sitting in the same position for a while now. A monosynaptic reflex. What is a synapse? A synapse is where one neuron touches another cell. So in a monosynaptic reflex, you have one neuron touching another neuron. And there is only one synapse there. There is only one meeting of neurons. That's a monosynaptic reflex. Polysynaptic means that you actually have more than one synapse. So if you look, this example actually has 3. Okay? That's a polysynaptic. It's more than one. Poly, more than one. So, there are 5 basic components to a reflex arc, and you know this. You've been learning this since chapter 1 when we talked about, not reflex arcs, feedback systems. You've got your sensory receptor that picks up the signal, the stimulus. You've got the sensory neuron that carries the action potential to the central nervous system. You've got the interneuron that connects the sensory neuron to the motor. You've got the motor neuron that carries the action potential from my central nervous system out to the body. And you have the effector organ that actually carries out the action dictated by your central nervous system. So, where is it? Here's my sensory receptor. Let's say that something is burning my arm, and that's the sensory receptor. This is the little dude. This is the dude that is picking up the stimulus, okay? Then I use this sensory neuron. See the green neuron right here? Sensory neuron carries that action potential from where the stimulus first started up into my central nervous system. That is his job. He takes the signal this direction, okay? The interneuron, which is this little black neuron right here, okay, connects my sensory neuron up here to my motor neuron down here, okay? So the interneuron connects the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. Now the motor neuron, number 4. The motor neuron is responsible for, motor neuron is responsible for carrying the signal from my central nervous system out to my effector. So this is my motor neuron carrying that signal out. Remember, my brain cannot move my arm. My brain doesn't leave my skull to go to my arm and cause it to move. So I have to basically select somebody to do it for me. If my arm is getting burned, I want to move my arm. So the effector organ, the one that takes the action in this case, is going to be a piece of skeletal muscle in my arm that actually shifts my arm back because I'm in pain. So these are the 5 parts of a reflex arc. And the reflex arc, I told you in chapter 1, it would haunt you forever. I'm still talking about the reflex arc in chapter 21, and I think 20. So you need to know this, guys. If you don't understand this, you need to take the time so that you do. If I were to tell you, name and describe the 5 pieces of the reflex arc, you need to be able to do that.